I spend most of my days on a roof or under a sink, which means I know exactly how things are supposed to fit together. And I know when something's off by a fraction of an inch. Her name was Tessa Bork, and from the first afternoon I met her, something about the way she looked at the world was off by exactly that much. Not broken, just slightly tilted, like a picture frame that nobody else bothered to straighten. She was a sous chef at a small French-Canadian bistro on Rue Saint-Paul in Old Montreal, the kind of place that smells like butter and thyme from half a block away and has a chalkboard menu that changes every Tuesday. I was there to fix a busted pipe under the prep sink. She was there at 6 in the morning, already in her apron, slicing shallots like she had a personal score to settle with them. "You're early," she said, without looking up. "Pipe doesn't care what time it is," I said. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was close enough to make me look up from my toolbox. That was 3.5 years ago. After the pipe job, she started texting me whenever something broke at the bistro. The walk-in cooler gasket, a loose tile behind the line, the exhaust hood that rattled every time it hit a certain RPM. I told myself I kept taking the calls because the bistro was a good client. Steady work, prompt payment, and the owner, a compact man named Gilles who wore the same gray wool vest every day regardless of season, always left a container of soup near the service entrance with my name on a piece of masking tape. But I would be lying to you if I said Tessa wasn't part of it. We fell into a rhythm that neither of us named. Tuesday mornings, if I had a job nearby, I'd stop in before service. She'd be prepping, I'd have a coffee at the end of the counter, and we'd talk about nothing that mattered. A raccoon that had been terrorizing her recycling bins, a documentary she'd watched about fishing villages on the Gaspé coast, the ongoing debate about whether poutine counted as a comfort food or a lifestyle. She never asked me to stay. I never said I was coming, but somehow it kept happening, and somehow it felt like the most reliable thing in my week. I told my older brother Nate about her once, briefly, in the parking lot of a Canadian Tire while we loaded bags of rock salt into his truck. He asked if I'd said anything to her. I told him it wasn't like that. He gave me the kind of look that older brothers are apparently issued at birth, patient, slightly pitying, and said, "You do know that's exactly what it's like, right?" I changed the subject to hockey. The thing about Tessa was that she was careful. Not cold, nothing like cold. But she measured things. She measured her words the same way she measured seasoning, precisely, deliberately, with both hands. She'd been in a long relationship before I met her, with the guy she'd moved from Sudbury to Montreal for, and when that ended, she didn't talk about it much, except to say once, matter-of-factly, while stirring a beurre blanc. I think I stopped being a person in that relationship and became more of a supporting character. I'm not in any rush to do that again. I thought about that sentence for weeks. The moment that changed, everything happened on a Thursday in February, in the middle of a hardware store on Jean Talon. I was helping Tessa pick out a light fixture for her apartment. She'd moved the previous fall into a place in Rosemont, and the ceiling light in her kitchen was the kind of bare bulb situation that made everything look like an interrogation. She'd asked if I'd install a proper fixture for her, and I'd said yes without hesitating, and then somehow that had turned into both of us standing in the lighting aisle of Renault Depot on a Thursday afternoon arguing about Kelvin temperatures. "Warm white," she said. "I don't want to feel like I'm performing surgery every time I make breakfast." "Then you don't want that one," I said, pointing to the one she was holding. "That's 5,000 K. That's basically a dental office." She made a face at the box and put it back. An older woman came around the corner of the aisle and stopped beside us, studying the same section. She looked between us, the way strangers sometimes do when they want to ask someone for help but aren't sure who to approach. "Are you two together?" she asked, meaning, I assumed, did we work there? I said, without really thinking about it, "She's my wife, actually. She handles the aesthetics, I handle the electrical." The woman smiled and said, "Oh, lovely," and asked Tessa what she'd recommend for a kitchen with yellow walls. Tessa answered her, something about 2700 K and a diffused shade, and I was already half turned back toward the shelf when I heard Tessa go quiet a beat too long. The woman said thank you and moved on, and when I looked back, Tessa was still holding a box she hadn't been holding a moment ago, not reading the label, just holding it. Her cheeks were, I don't know how else to say it. She was not someone who blushed easily. She was practical and dry, and had once described a kitchen fire with the same emotional register most people use to describe mildly inconvenient traffic. But she was flushed, and she was looking at the middle distance, and she said, very quietly, almost to herself, "I wouldn't hate that. I heard it. I know I heard it. And I stood there for approximately 3 seconds too long, and then I said, "The 2700K one, right? That's what you told her?" And I pulled it off the shelf, and we went to the register. I didn't say anything in the car. She didn't either. I installed the fixture. It took about 40 minutes. She made pasta while I worked, and we ate at her kitchen table under the new light, which was exactly the right warmth, and she said, "Okay, you were right. That's better." And I said, "You made the call? I just did the wiring." And she smiled at her fork. I drove home and sat in my truck in my parking spot for longer than I should have, engine off, staring at a snow ridge on the hood. I kept hearing it. I wouldn't hate that. Did she mean it? Had it been reflex, a slip, a half-thought she hadn't meant to let out? Or had she been holding it the same way I'd been holding something I hadn't had the guts to name in 3.5 years? I didn't text her that night. I didn't text her Friday. Saturday morning, she sent me a photo of her kitchen with the light on and just a single word. Perfect. I typed 4 different replies and deleted all of them. I knew what I wanted to say. Something real. Something that matched the weight of what she'd said in that aisle. But I'd spent 3.5 years treating this like it was something separate from what it actually was, and I didn't know how to pivot without making it awkward, without making her feel like she'd accidentally opened a door she hadn't meant to open. So I sent back a thumbs up emoji, like a complete coward, and went to bed. The next 2 weeks were fine on the surface. We texted normally. I stopped into the bistro once on a Tuesday, and she gave me a coffee, and we talked about a provincial park she was thinking about visiting in the spring. But something had shifted. Subtly, the way a foundation shifts, you can't always see it, but you can feel it in the doorframes. She seemed careful around me in a new way, and I was careful around her, which made it worse. Then, about 3 weeks after the hardware store, I was picking up lumber near her neighborhood, and I thought I'd stop by. No plan, no particular reason. I grabbed a container of poutine from the casse-croûte she liked on Beaubien, the one that does their gravy from scratch and doesn't apologize for the cheese curds, and I went to her door. She didn't answer right away. When she did, she was in the middle of something. She looked slightly flustered, which was unusual for her, and then a voice came from inside the apartment. A man's voice. Easy, comfortable, like he'd been there before. Tessa looked at me, and I looked at the container of poutine in my hands, and there was a moment where neither of us said anything, and the whole hallway felt like it was leaning in. "Hey," she said. "I didn't know you were coming." "I was nearby," I said. I held up the container. "Doesn't matter. I'll leave it at Miles," she said. That was my name. She said it like a sentence. "It's fine," I said. "I'll text you." And I left the poutine on the little shelf beside her door, the one she kept her keys on, and I walked back to my truck. I sat there for a while, long enough for the radio to cycle through 2 songs I didn't register. Then I drove home. His name, I found out later through the kind of small city coincidence that Montreal specializes in, was Christopher Dalt. Tessa had mentioned him to a mutual friend, a woman named Brigitte, who ran a flower stall at the Marché Jean Talon and who knew everybody's business with the cheerful efficiency of a small-town newspaper. Christopher was in finance. He had an apartment in Griffintown. He was, by Bridget's account, attentive and well-dressed, and had already taken Tessa to dinner twice in the 10 days she'd known him. 10 days. I had known her for 3.5 years, and I had never taken her to dinner. I thought about calling Nate. I didn't. I already knew what he'd say. Work helped, the way it always does. I had a full week. A kitchen renovation in Westmount, a bathroom gut job in Verdun, a deck repair in Pointe Claire that turned out to be more complicated than the scope suggested. I threw myself at all of it. I was at a job site at 7 every morning, and I barely stopped for lunch. Then Brigitte texted me. Not about Tessa. She texted me about a handyman job she wanted done at the market, a gutter issue above her stall. But at the end of the message, she added, "I think you should know he's convincing her to invest in something. A property deal." I told her to be careful. I don't think she's listening. I read it 3 times. I knew enough about property deals and fast-talking finance guys. I'd done renovation work for enough people burned by them to know that investment opportunity, plus just started dating, plus Griffintown address, was not a combination I liked. But it wasn't my business. Tessa wasn't mine to protect. She was a grown adult who'd navigated her own life long before I started fixing pipes in her kitchen. I put my phone down and sanded a subfloor for 20 minutes. Then I picked it back up and texted Brigitte. What kind of deal? What Brigitte sent me over the next hour. Screenshots from a group chat Tessa had been added to, a website that looked professional but had been registered 4 months ago, a company name that didn't appear in the Quebec Business Registry, was enough to make me feel sick. Christopher Dalt wasn't in finance. Or rather, he was in a version of finance that didn't have a regulatory body and relied heavily on people trusting an attractive man in good shoes. The property investment was a private syndicate pitching pre-construction units in a development that existed only as a render and a brochure. The minimum buy-in was $18,000. I looked it up for another hour to be sure. The development company had no physical address. The principal listed had been the subject of a complaint with the AMF, the Autorité des Marchés Financiers, 2 years prior under a different company name. The case had been settled quietly. I called Tessa. She didn't pick up. I called again 20 minutes later. She picked up on the second ring, sounding slightly guarded. "Miles, I need to tell you something," I said. "And I need you to hear me out before you say anything." Silence. "I know you don't owe me an explanation about anything in your life," I said, "but I spent the last 2 hours looking into Christopher Dalt, and what I found, you need to see it." Another silence. Longer. "How do you even know about him?" she asked, and there was an edge in her voice I hadn't heard before. "Bridget," I said. "She was worried. So was I." "You were worried," she repeated, not a question. "Tessa. This guy has a complaint filed against him with the AMF. The company doesn't exist in the Quebec registry. The development he's pitching is, it's not real. Or if it is, it's not legal. Please don't give him money." The silence stretched long enough that I thought she'd hung up. Then she said, very quietly, "I already gave him a check. The amount was $9,000, half of what he'd asked, because she'd told him she needed to think about the rest. She hadn't deposited the full amount yet. The check had been dated for the following Monday. I told her to cancel it. She called her bank. Then she called me back. "They can stop it if he hasn't deposited it yet," she said. She sounded like someone trying to keep their voice level while standing on ice they weren't sure would hold. "I have to go to the branch in person Monday morning." "I'll go with you," I said, "if you want." She didn't answer immediately. "Tessa, why are you doing this?" she asked, and the way she said it, it wasn't accusatory. It was genuinely uncertain, like she'd been turning the question over for a while and hadn't found the bottom of it. I could have said something safe. "I'm a good friend, that's all. I didn't want you to get hurt." The kind of thing that costs nothing and commits to nothing. Instead, I said, "Because I should have said something 3 weeks ago in that hardware store, and I didn't, and I've been sitting with it ever since." The longest pause yet. "Miles," she said. And then, softer, "You really said that at the worst possible time. I know. I need to deal with Monday first." "I know," I said. "I'll be at your place at 8:30. Monday morning I was there at 8:20. She opened the door in her coat, keys already in hand, and she looked like she hadn't slept great. Neither had I. We walked to the bank on Saint-Denis. It was cold, properly cold, the kind of February cold that makes the city look like a black and white photograph. She had her hands tucked into her pockets, and she walked with her shoulders up around her ears. At the branch, a woman named Sophie Lefebvre at the business desk was professional and thorough, and had the check stopped within 20 minutes. When we walked out, Tessa stopped on the sidewalk and just stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, the cold air hitting her face. "Okay," she said. "Okay," I said. She opened her eyes and looked at me directly, the way she looked at a dish she was evaluating. Fully present, no hedging. "You said you should have said something 3 weeks ago," she said. "Yeah. What would you have said?" I'd been rehearsing versions of this for 2 weeks. Every version I'd rehearsed sounded wrong out loud, so I didn't use any of them. "That it wasn't a joke," I said. "When I said you were my wife, it wasn't a joke. It was the first honest thing I'd said out loud about how I felt in 3.5 years. She looked at me for a long moment. A taxi went past. Someone's boots crunched in the snow down the block. "I told myself the reason I didn't say anything after," she said slowly, "was because you didn't follow it up. Because you just pivoted to the light fixture. Like it hadn't happened." I froze, I said. "I've been kicking myself about it since." "I thought you were letting me know it was a joke," she said, "so I tried to let it go. And then Christopher was..." She paused. "He was very easy to be around. Easier than sitting with something I thought wasn't going anywhere." "That's my fault," I said. "Partially," she said, and something in her voice relaxed by a fraction. "I could have said something too." "You did," I said, "in the aisle. You said you wouldn't hate it." I said that very quietly. "I heard you." She looked down at the sidewalk and then back up at me. Her cheeks were red, but that was probably the cold. "What do you want, Miles?" And I thought, I want Tuesday mornings at the end of the counter. I want to know which documentary she's watching and whether the raccoon finally figured out the bungee cord on the bin. I want to install things in her apartment and eat at her kitchen table under a light we picked out together. I want to stop sitting in my truck talking myself out of saying things. I want to take you to dinner, I said. An actual dinner, not just coffee at the end of the counter. A real one, if you'd like that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's a place on Laurier. Does duck confit? I've been wanting to go for 2 years." "Saturday," I said. "Saturday," she said. We stood on the sidewalk in front of the bank in the February cold, and she didn't move to leave right away, and I didn't either. The city moved around us the way cities do, indifferent and ongoing. "For what it's worth," she said finally. "I heard what you said to that woman in the store too. And I didn't think it was a joke. I just didn't know if you meant it." "I meant it," I said. She nodded slowly, like she was settling something into place. "Okay," she said again. And this time it sounded different, like the word had more room in it. "Saturday, we went to the place on Laurier. The duck confit was exactly as good as she'd hoped. We stayed until they started stacking chairs near the bar. She laughed at something I said and put her hand over mine on the table, and I thought, 3.5 years. We spent 3.5 years one conversation away from this. Walking back to her apartment, our breath visible in the cold air, she said, "You know what the worst part is? I think Brigitte knew the whole time." "Brigitte knows everything," I said. "She's going to be insufferable about this." "Absolutely," I said. Tessa laughed. It was the same laugh I'd been cataloging for 3.5 years. The one that started quiet and then didn't. The one that made people at adjacent tables glance over and smile without knowing why. I'd been listening to that laugh since a February morning over a broken pipe, and I had never once gotten tired of it. At her door, she looked at me the same way she had on the sidewalk outside the bank. Fully present. No hedging. "Thank you for Monday," she said. "And for not pretending the hardware store didn't happen." "I should have brought it up the same day," I said. "Yes," she agreed. "But you're here now." She went inside. I walked back to my truck. The city was quiet, the way Montreal gets quiet in winter, which is not truly quiet but muffled, softened at the edges, the sound of a place that knows how to settle into itself. I sat for a moment before I started the engine, not because I needed to, just because I wanted to hold it, that feeling of something that had been slightly tilted finally, carefully, returning to level.